Hello and welcome to my channel. I hope you enjoy this story. I'm going to try and upload a new story each day. The Phantom Orchestra. On the Isle of Wight, there is a road seldom traveled, where the wind whispers secrets and shadows dance just out of sight. Holly Arnold, a young musician seeking inspiration, had heard rumors about an old concert hall hidden deep in the woods. The building, once a beacon of culture and artistry, had been abandoned for over a century after a tragic fire claimed the lives of an entire orchestra during their final performance. They said the flames had taken the musicians mid-note, their melodies cut short, never to be heard again. Intrigued, Holly packed her violin and set off to find this legendary hall. She had been stuck in a creative rut for months, and the thought of uncovering an ancient piece of musical history excited her. The idea that some notes might still linger in the air, or that the walls of the concert hall might hum with forgotten symphonies, was enough to draw her in. The trek to the hall was long and treacherous. Holly followed a crumbling path through thick woods, where the trees grew so closely together that they seemed to form an impenetrable barrier. The deeper she went, the more the air changed. It grew heavier, cooler, and filled with an odd sort of static, like the world itself was holding its breath. Finally, Holly reached a clearing. Before her stood the concert hall, more decrepit than she had imagined. Its once grand facade was crumbling, vines clung to its walls, and broken windows gaped like the mouths of the dead. The doors, tall and blackened by smoke, creaked as she pushed them open. Inside, the hall was eerily intact. Rows of decaying seats faced a massive stage, and above it, a chandelier hung precariously, its crystals darkened with soot. The air was thick with the scent of charred wood and something else, something cold, metallic, like the aftertaste of old blood. Holly shivered but pressed on, the urge to explore overcoming her unease. Her footsteps echoed as she walked down the aisle, the sound oddly muted, swallowed by the oppressive silence of the place. She made her way to the stage, where an ancient piano sat. The keys, though yellowed and cracked, seemed untouched by time. On a whim, Holly reached out and pressed one. The note that followed was faint, but clear, barely perfect. It resonated through the hall, hanging in the air longer than it should have, as though reluctant to fade. Suddenly, Holly felt a chill at her back, like cold breath on her neck. She turned sharply, but the hall was as empty as before. Yet something had changed. The air was vibrating, charged with an unseen energy. Then she heard it, the softest note, a violin's whisper, barely audible at first. Holly froze, her heart pounding. It was coming from the stage. Slowly she turned back and gasped. There, in the center of the stage, the outline of a figure began to form, a man, dressed in the tattered remains of a conductor's suit. His face was pale and expressionless, his eyes hollow pits of darkness. In his hand he held a baton, which he raised slowly, as if preparing to conduct. Behind him, other figures materialized, ghostly musicians in faded, soot-covered attire. Violins, cellos, trumpets, and drums hovered in the air, held by translucent hands. Their eyes were locked on Holly, their faces blank, yet she felt an overwhelming sense of sorrow emanating from them. The conductor's baton flicked downward, and the music began. It was haunting, a melody that seemed to pull at Holly's very soul. It was beautiful and terrifying, filled with anguish and longing. The notes swirled around her, wrapping her in their cold embrace. Holly's breath quickened, her pulse racing as the ghostly orchestra played, the sound growing louder, more intense. She tried to move, to flee, but her feet were rooted to the spot. The music had her in its grip, pulling her deeper into its mournful refrain. And then the violin. It called to her, its voice clearer than the rest, sharp and beckoning. Holly's hand moved on its own, reaching for her violin case. "No," she whispered, fighting the urge, but it was no use. Her fingers trembled as she pulled the instrument from its case. The bow felt cold in her hand, like ice. The ghostly conductor turned his hollow gaze to her and nodded. Without thinking, Holly lifted her violin and placed it under her chin. The moment the bow touched the strings, her mind was flooded with visions. She saw the fire, felt the heat, heard the screams of the musicians as the flames consumed them. Their final notes echoed in her ears, unfinished, desperate to be completed. She began to play, her fingers moving of their own accord. The melody she played was not her own, it was theirs. The music surged through her, each note more intense than the last, the sorrow so deep it threatened to swallow her whole. The ghostly musicians joined her, their instruments rising in perfect harmony. The conductor smiled a slow, hollow thing, and for the first time Holly understood. They were trapped, bound to this place by their unfinished symphony. They needed her to complete it, to set them free. As the final note rang out, the room fell silent. Holly collapsed to the stage, her breath coming in ragged gasps. The ghostly figures began to fade, their forms dissolving into the shadows, but not before the conductor gave her one last, solemn nod of gratitude. The hall grew dark once more, and Holly was alone. She lay there for what felt like hours, the weight of the music still pressing on her chest. When she finally rose, her limbs were heavy, her mind clouded. She stumbled from the stage, leaving her violin behind. It no longer felt like hers. Outside, the woods were quiet, the air still. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the path as Holly made her way back to civilization. She had given the ghosts their freedom, but something of them lingered within her. The music had not left her. It played on, a haunting melody in the back of her mind, growing louder with each passing day. And sometimes, in the dead of night, she would wake to find her fingers moving, tracing the notes of a song she could never forget. Days passed, but the echoes of the Phantom Symphony haunted Holly. She tried to return to her normal routine, practicing, teaching music lessons, performing at small gigs, but the melodies from the abandoned hall clung to her mind like a ghost that refused to leave. No matter what she did, the haunting tune persisted, threading through her every thought, filling the silence with its mournful, unrelenting refrain. Her dreams were the worst. Each night she found herself back in the decaying concert hall, standing on that cursed stage. The conductor's lifeless eyes followed her every move, and the ghostly musicians awaited her lead. In these dreams she always picked up her violin, compelled to play that same heart-wrenching piece. It was as though the music had become part of her, weaving itself into her very soul. And every time the final note sounded in her dream, she woke drenched in cold sweat, her heart pounding in her chest. One afternoon, Holly couldn't stand it anymore. She grabbed her violin and headed into the woods, her feet carrying her instinctively toward the old concert hall. The path seemed more familiar this time, as if it had etched itself into her memory, guiding her toward the inevitable. The building loomed before her once again, just as it had that first night. The door, hanging askew on rusted hinges, creaked ominously as she pushed it open. The scent of burnt wood and damp earth filled her nostrils, the same suffocating atmosphere wrapping around her like a shroud. Holly stepped inside, her violin tucked under her arm. The hall was silent, the kind of silence that presses in on you from all sides, thick and oppressive. She crossed the creaky wooden floor, her footsteps barely making a sound, and stopped in the center of the stage. For a moment, nothing happened. The hall remained still, lifeless. But then a soft whisper of music filled the air. It started faintly, as if coming from far away, but grew louder, more distinct with every passing second. Holly's heart raced as a ghostly orchestra began to materialize before her eyes once more, the conductor, the musicians, all standing in their places, waiting. They wanted something from her. She could feel it, a pull deep in her chest, as if they had left something unfinished. Her hand trembled as she lifted her violin and positioned the bow over the strings. The moment the bow made contact, the music exploded around her, filling the hall with its eerie beauty. But this time, something was different. The melody was unfamiliar, more frantic and dissonant, laced with urgency. Holly played along, her fingers moving effortlessly, guided by the music itself. The conductor's hollow eyes bored into her, his expression one of desperate anticipation. She was no longer just playing for them, she was leading them, completing what they had started. As the music swelled to its peak, Holly felt an overwhelming surge of emotion, grief, fear, rage. It wasn't hers, but it coursed through her like fire. The ghost's final moments were woven into the music, their anguish and terror encapsulated in every note. The flames that had taken them, the panic that had filled the hall as they tried to escape, the last, desperate attempt to finish the performance before everything was consumed, it was all there, in the music. Suddenly, the chandelier above began to rattle violently, the crystals clinking together as the air around Holly grew thick with a burning heat. The walls trembled, and the floorboards groaned as if the building itself was awakening. But still the conductor's baton moved, and Holly's fingers obeyed. She was trapped in the music, bound by its power. Her body ached with the strain, her mind teetering on the edge of exhaustion, but the music wouldn't stop. It surged through her like a living thing, demanding to be completed. And then, with a final, heart-wrenching note, it ended. The hall fell into silence once more. The ghostly figures on stage faded into the shadows, dissolving like mist under the morning sun. The conductor gave Holly one last, mournful glance before he too vanished, his form melting into the darkness. Holly collapsed to the stage, her violin slipping from her grasp. She lay there, gasping for breath, her body trembling with exhaustion. But this time something felt different. The weight that had been pressing on her chest since that first night seemed to lift, and the oppressive silence that had haunted her was gone. She didn't know how long she lay there, but when she finally found the strength to stand, the hall felt peaceful. The air was lighter, the lingering scent of smoke and decay gone. It was as though the ghosts had been freed, their tragic final symphony at last completed. But as Holly turned to leave, something caught her eye. On the floor, where the conductor had stood, lay a small, withered music score. She picked it up, her fingers brushing over the yellowed pages. The title was barely legible, the ink faded with time, but she could just make it out, Requiem for the Forgotten. She stared at the score, a strange sense of familiarity washing over her. The notes written there, the very ones she had played, were etched into her memory now. It was their final gift, their way of saying thank you. Holly tucked the score under her arm and left the concert hall for the last time. As she stepped into the cool evening air, she felt a deep sense of closure. The ghosts had been laid to rest, their unfinished symphony finally complete. But as she walked back through the woods, a quiet melody hummed in the back of her mind. It wasn't the same haunting tune from before, but something new, something beautiful, yet tinged with sadness. Holly knew she would never forget the Phantom Orchestra, nor the night she had played their final notes. The music would always be with her, woven into the fabric of her being, a reminder of the souls she had helped set free. And sometimes, late at night, when the world was silent and still, she would find herself playing that Requiem for the Forgotten, her fingers moving over the strings as though guided by unseen hands. For in the music the ghosts still lived, their melodies echoing forever in the shadows of the Isle of Wight. Thank you for listening. I hope you enjoyed this story. Please don't forget to like, and even better, like and subscribe. Thank you very much, and I hope you have had or have a great day.